Have you ever found yourself, just captivated by the really big questions, the ones that feel, well, ancient, maybe even a little spooky?
Hmm.
Like, what is consciousness really? What actually happens in those final moments of life?
Yeah.
Or are there people out there with abilities that just seem to defy, well, conventional science?
Right. These topics often feel so elusive, don't they? Almost impossible to pin down with measurable scientific tools.
Exactly. But what if we could find some kind of scientific anchor? Measurable physical clues that maybe hint at something. Wow, extraordinary.
And that's exactly where we're diving today. We're exploring sources that are really trying to tackle consciousness, that boundary between life and death,
Yeah.
the surprising possibility of genetic links to reported psychic abilities, and even a look from the humanities field at the fundamental challenge of trying to measure something you can't easily measure.
Wow. Okay. So we've got quite a stack of material here crossing different disciplines.
We do.
We're looking at a scientific study on the genetics of psychic ability, a deep dive into what neuroscience says happens in the brain when we die, drawing a lot from near-death experiences,
Mhm.
a historical glance at the whole conversation around life after death, and this really thought-provoking piece from the humanities about assessing quality, which it offers a striking parallel, actually.
Yeah, it does. Our mission really is to unpack all of this for you, our listener, to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the findings that genuinely make you stop and think,
Right.
and sort of see what these seemingly different areas of research might reveal about, well, the nature of our minds and maybe even existence itself.
Okay, let's jump right in then. We're starting with something truly,
Hmm.
well, out there exit ability.
Okay.
For centuries, you hear stories, right?
Hmm.
Beliefs that maybe these extraordinary abilities, like lots of other traits, might just run in families.
Mm-hmm. That intuition.
It begs the question, doesn't it? Is there something biological, maybe even genetic, sort of underpinning these claims?
That very intuition is the starting point for the pilot study we looked at, titled Genetics of Psychic Ability. Their goal was, well, ambitious,
I bet.
to try and identify a genetic marker, a biological correlate for abilities like telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, that sort of thing.
Okay, but how do you even begin to study something like that scientifically? It seems
Mhm.
so subjective.
Well, they used a case control design. They started pretty broadly, screening over 3,000 people globally who claimed to have psychic abilities.
3,000. Wow.
Yeah. And a crucial step, really important, was carefully filtering these candidates to exclude anyone showing signs of psychotic or delusional disorder.
Oh, absolutely essential. You have to be sure you're studying the claimed phenomenon itself, not, a symptom of something else.
Precisely. So that whole process narrowed the field down quite a bit to 13 individuals they selected as psychic cases.
Okay, 13.
Yeah. All female, Caucasian, and over 37 in this particular group. Then they recruited 10 control subjects, carefully matched for age, sex, and ethnicity, who did not claim psychic abilities.
All right, so 13 cases, 10 controls, matched. Then they sequenced their DNA, I assume.
Yes. They used what's called whole exome sequencing that mainly looks at the protein coding regions of DNA, the exons.
The parts that build stuff.
Exactly. But interestingly, one of their independent analyses also included some adjacent non-coding regions, like introns. And having two independent analyses, well, that adds a layer of reliability to what they found, or didn't find.
Okay, so the big question. Did they find the psychic gene in that coding DNA? The part that makes the proteins?
Well, here's where it gets really surprising. Their initial finding
Hmm.
in the protein coding sequences, the exons,
Yeah.
there were no significant differences detected between the psychic cases and the controls.
Wait, none. No difference in the building instructions. That seems to immediately deflate the whole idea of a simple genetic link, doesn't it?
It certainly does, yeah, if you're only looking at the protein-making machinery. But that second analysis, the one that peered into those adjacent non-coding regions, that told a different story.
Huh?
They found a difference. In an intron, remember, that's a non-protein coding region right next to a gene called TNRC18 on chromosome 7.
A difference in the genomes.
Yeah.
Is what some people call dark matter, the non-coding bits. What kind of difference was it?
It was a specific, quite subtle variation, an alteration from GG to GA at a particular spot.
Okay, GG to GA.
And the pattern was, well, compelling, this GG to GA variation. It was found in 7 out of the 9 controls they could analyze for this specific spot,
Right.
but it was completely absent from all 13 of the psychic cases.
Hold on. So the controls had this variation and the psychics didn't. That feels backwards, doesn't it? If you're looking for a genetic marker of the ability.
It does feel counterintuitive.
Yeah, it's like finding a marker for the absence of it.
It is. And the authors themselves, they offer the most conservative interpretation first. Look, it could just be random chance. It's a small pilot sample.
Fair enough. Small study.
But then they acknowledge its potential significance, especially when you put it in the context of other evidence, like historical reports, surveys showing lots of people feel they've had psychic experiences, family studies.
Like the second sight thing in Scotland?
Exactly, like that tradition. One study even suggested a specific inheritance pattern there. So this study used modern tools, didn't find a simple psychic gene in the coding bits,
Right.
but found this really intriguing hint in the non-coding DNA, the regions that often act as the regulatory control room for the genome.
So it's not the gene, but maybe a marker or an influence somewhere in the control system.
That's the idea. It suggests a potential marker or maybe an influence located in those non-coding regions. We now know those regions are critical for regulating gene expression, turning genes on and off.
Why is finding any potential link, even if it's in this non-coding dark matter, why is that significant?
Well, it's significant because it starts to ground the investigation in actual biology. It shifts the conversation, from being purely anecdotal stories or psychological guesswork towards something potentially having a physical correlate you can study objectively.
Right, something measurable.
And finding the hint in non-coding DNA is also really important. It reminds us that genetic influence isn't just about the proteins we make, but also about how and when those proteins get produced. This difference isn't saying these individuals have a gene for psychic ability, but maybe that their genetic background influences something related to that capacity, or perhaps the lack of it in this specific finding.
It definitely justifies their call for more research, doesn't it? It's a provocative starting point using these modern techniques.
Absolutely. It really is. Now, let's shift gears to another profound mystery, one that touches everyone eventually. What actually happens in the brain at the very end of life?
Oh yeah, this is a topic loaded with, well, curiosity, maybe even a little apprehension for some. We hear these incredible stories about near-death experiences, NDEs, but what does the actual science tell us about the brain itself during those final moments?
The review article, What Happens in the Brain When We Die, really dives into this. And a lot of the subjective data we have about that threshold comes from survivors of near-death experiences, the NDEs you mentioned.
NDEs are so widely reported. What are the consistent themes, the hallmarks mentioned in the source?
Well, common reports include things like memory recall, vivid flashbacks, the classic out-of-body experience, or OBE.
Right, feeling like you're floating above yourself.
Exactly. Also, the sensation of moving through a tunnel towards a bright light, feelings of profound peace, sometimes a life review, and often a lasting reduction in the fear of death afterwards.
And the source mentions these are pretty consistent across cultures and ages.
Yes, strikingly so. It's well documented, even going back historically.
The big debate, though, is always, are NDEs proof of something beyond the brain, survival of consciousness, or are they incredibly complex phenomena happening within the dying brain itself?
That's the core question. Clinically, defining death has evolved. Right. It used to be just the heart stopping. Now it includes brain death, irreversible coma. Standard criteria involve assessing things like reflexes, coma depth, absence of spontaneous breathing, and EEG, which measures brain electrical activity, is often part of that. A flat line for a certain period is usually a key criterion for brain death.
But the source says EEG has limitations.
It does. Things like sensitivity, other factors confounding the signal, even variability in how different people interpret the readings. It's not always straightforward.
Okay, so the clinical criteria are there, but the neurophysiological picture, maybe it's more complicated. What's happening at the cellular level when the brain loses oxygen, like in cardiac arrest?
It's pretty brutal for neurons. They're extremely sensitive to oxygen deprivation, ischemia, the lack of blood flow, just rapidly depletes their energy. And that triggers this whole cascade. Ion pumps fail, calcium floods into the cells, excitatory neurotransmitters like glutamate get released excessively, which activates enzymes that essentially start to break down the cell's structure. It's a vicious cycle, a really rapid process of cellular damage.
Wow, sounds like a catastrophic shutdown.
But the brain's electrical activity, the EEG stuff, it's more than just cell death, right? It's about those synchronized rhythms.
Exactly. EEG captures these neural oscillations, rhythmic electrical activity from large groups of neurons firing together. These rhythms happen at different frequencies, delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. And in a healthy, awake brain, they're linked to different functions like memory, perception, attention, consciousness itself.
And are these specific rhythms, these oscillations, linked to the components of NDEs, even in healthy brains, like the out-of-body feeling or memory recall?
Studies suggest there are correlations, yeah.
Yeah.
For instance, NDE survivors recalling their experiences show different patterns of theta and delta activity compared to control subjects just recalling ordinary memories.
And out-of-body experiences, OBEs, in healthy subjects. They've been linked to activity in a specific brain region, the temporoparietal junction, or TPJ. Researchers observed changes in alpha and gamma oscillations there during induced OBEs.
Okay, so the building blocks of NDE's memory recall, that out-of-body sensation they seem to have, correlates in normal brain activity. But what about the dying brain? This is where the findings get really mind-bending, right?
This is where the review presents some absolutely fascinating and sometimes, frankly, contradictory data. Early animal studies, like those involving decapitation or induced ischemia, they hinted at bursts of high-frequency activity, like gamma oscillations, happening right after the insult.
Gamma.
Yeah.
It's linked to higher cognitive functions, right?
Often, yes, perception consciousness. But a landmark study later, in rats after induced cardiac arrest, found something even more striking, a surge of gamma oscillations across all brain regions, starting about 30 seconds after the heart stopped beating.
30 seconds after, before the EEG went flat.
Before the EEG went flat, yes. And this surge wasn't just random noise, it appeared organized. It involved increased connectivity between different brain areas and coupling with slower rhythms like theta and alpha.
Activity and organized activity after the heart is stopped. That completely turns the idea of an immediate lights out on its head.
It really does. It strongly suggested that the mammalian brain might actually be capable of generating neural correlates of conscious processing after circulatory function has totally ceased.
Wow. What about humans? Is the data similar?
Human data is, predictably, much harder to get and more variable. Some studies using simpler monitors, like BIS monitors often used in anesthesia, which just look at the front of the brain, show activity decreasing pretty quickly, sometimes even before the heart stops completely in dying patients.
Okay.
But studies using whole brain EEG, with more electrodes covering more area and specific case reports, they offer different insights.
Like what? Tell me about those.
Well, some human studies have detected brain activity continuing after the last detected heartbeat. These have sometimes been termed end-of-life electrical surges, or ELS.
ELS, end-of-life electrical surges.
Right. And then there's the Large AWARE study. This looked at cardiac arrest survivors. A significant percentage reported memories, NDEs, or even, get this, verifiable awareness and recall of events that happened during their resuscitation.
Wait, while they were clinically dead, after crossing that threshold?
After they had clinically crossed the threshold of death and resuscitation efforts were actively underway, they remembered things.
They were clinically dead and remembered things happening in the room during resuscitation. That is just staggering.
That's what their reports suggest, yes. And there was a very recent human case report, an 87-year-old patient whose EEG was being monitored for other reasons during a terminal event.
Yeah.
They showed a surge of relative gamma power about 30 seconds after cardiac arrest. Now, relative gamma is key here, meaning even though the overall brain activity was dropping massively, the proportion of the remaining activity that was in that high-frequency gamma band actually increased. And this gamma activity was also modulated by alpha rhythms, which is similar to patterns seen in healthy people experiencing OBEs.
Okay, that relative gamma surge happening after cardiac arrest, potentially linked to OBE-like patterns. That feels like a really powerful piece of data.
It's certainly compelling. Another study, this one in monkeys, showed that cortical neuron activity dropped after cardiac arrest, but then reappeared in bursts, sometimes up to 2 hours later.
2 hours.
Up to 2 hours later. And importantly, the source also notes that deeper brainstem neurons are actually more resilient to ischemia, to lack of oxygen, than the cortical neurons that the scalp EEG primarily measures.
Oh, okay, so a flat line on the scalp EEG might just mean the cortex is silent, but deeper structures could still be active.
That's the implication. A flat EEG might indicate cortical silence, but deeper brain activity could potentially persist for some time.
So, a flat line isn't necessarily the absolute end of all function.
Precisely. Experimental studies even show that neurons and synapses can enter a kind of dormant state with an isoelectric or flat EEG, but still be capable of responding if you stimulate them. This really makes you question when brain function truly ceases at the cellular and network level.
These findings are just extraordinary. They make you seriously question the conventional wisdom about what happens right at the moment of death. The brain doesn't seem to just quietly shut down. There might be these distinct phases, even organized electrical activity happening after the heart stops.
It definitely adds significant layers of complexity to our understanding. These surges and patterns, even though they're variable across studies, they suggest the brain undergoes a really dynamic process in its final stages. It forces us to ask, what is the relationship, if any, between these measurable brain activities and those profound subjective experiences reported in NDEs?
And this leads right into the difficulty of actually measuring these incredibly complex processes accurately. The source points out there seem to be chronological phases the dying brain goes through, which makes getting a clear picture even trickier.
Right. Based mainly on animal models where they induce oxygen deprivation and sometimes restore it, researchers see these distinct phases. There might be an initial phase with an early surge of activity, maybe beta or gamma waves, rhythmic activity,
Okay, an initial surge.
followed by a decline heading towards electrical silence, the isoelectric EEG. This phase also involves a massive wave of depolarization sweeping across neurons, sometimes starkly called the wave of death.
The wave of death. That sounds incredibly final.
It signifies a major breakdown. It involves a loss of normal cellular properties and pretty much blocks neural signaling. But, and this is crucial, there's often a third phase described, the potential for recovery, sometimes called the wave of resuscitation, if oxygen is restored reasonably quickly.
Recovery. Even after that wave.
Potentially, yes. One study mentioned showed molecular and cellular recovery in a pig brain even after 4 hours of electrical silence post-mortem.
Recovery after 4 hours of a flatline. That's astonishing. And it highlights the first big challenge the source mentions. How do you even define death electrophysiologically if recovery is possible after such silence?
Exactly. Clinical criteria, like, say, 30 minutes of EEG silence, they don't really account for this observed potential for recovery seen in experimental settings. What we define as dead using one specific tool might look very different if we could measure activity at a deeper level, or maybe a more granular cellular level, or just over a longer period.
And that leads right into the second major challenge.
Yeah.
The sheer variability in the data we do get, and the potential for contamination. Why do different studies seem to get such different results?
Oh, there are so many factors at play. First, the way you record matters hugely. Those simple frontal monitors, like the BIS monitors with just 2 to 4 electrodes, they capture a very different picture than a whole brain EEG with, say, 16 or more electrodes.
Right, different coverage.
And then microvascular recordings done within the brain tissue itself can detect activity that's completely invisible to a global scalp EEG. Also, different brain regions might not die or cease function at the exact same rate. And of course, the point at which the recording stops, that inherently truncates the picture you get.
So the tools you use, how you use them, where you look, and for how long, all drastically shape what you see.
Absolutely. The model used is also critical. Animal studies use controlled methods like decapitation, induced cardiac arrest, controlled oxygen deprivation, which tend to yield more specific, consistent patterns.
Right.
Human studies, by necessity, are happening in real-world, often chaotic situations. They're confounded by the patient's underlying illness, whatever medications they're on, the unpredictable nature of dying itself. You just can't standardize dying in humans the way you can in a lab animal.
Yeah, you're dealing with a highly uncontrolled environment compared to a lab setting. Makes sense.
And then there's the issue of contamination, especially for those high-frequency gamma waves we talked about earlier.
Right, the ones potentially linked to consciousness.
Exactly. Things like muscle artifacts, tiny muscle twitches, pain responses, even certain medications like anesthetics or dissociatives can mimic or significantly affect gamma activity. In the complex environment of a hospital during a terminal event, it's incredibly difficult to perfectly isolate brain signals from all these other factors.
But the takeaway from the source seems to be, interpret all this data really carefully, understand the limitations of each method and setting, and there's a real need for more standardized guidelines in future research to try and reduce some of this variability.
Precisely. Given how incredibly challenging it is to capture any data during this unpredictable process, every data point is valuable, but its meaning has to be interpreted very carefully within the context of exactly how and where it was obtained.
Okay, so we've explored this really fascinating, if tentative, possibility of a genetic hint for psychic ability, maybe hidden in the non-coding DNA. And then we've dived deep into the complex, sometimes really counterintuitive electrical activity happening in the brain around the time of death, including what NDEs might tell us.
Yeah.
Both of these lines of research are fundamentally trying to apply objective, measurable scientific methods to phenomena that seem inherently subjective, maybe even intangible.
And this fundamental challenge, trying to apply quantitative tools, numbers, measurements to something that feels qualitative, elusive, maybe even ineffable. It isn't unique to these cutting-edge scientific areas. It's actually a problem grappled with even in fields like the humanities.
Really? How so?
That's where the piece we read, the one titled 21 Grams, Interdisciplinarity and the Assessment of Quality in the Humanities, offers such a compelling parallel.
Ah, the 21 grams title.
Yeah.
That's famous, isn't it? From that old experiment.
It immediately brings to mind Dr. Duncan McDougall's 1901 experiment,
Okay.
where he literally tried to measure the weight lost by a body at the exact moment of death. He concluded it was around 21 grams, his attempt to physically weigh the human soul.
Wow. Talk about a strikingly literal attempt to quantify the unquantifiable.
Absolutely. And you can see the echoes in our other sources, can't you? The genetic study is seeking a physical, quantifiable basis, a specific DNA variation for something non-physical, psychic ability.
Right.
They found a hint, yeah, but not in a simple protein-coding gene. It was in the genome's dark matter. They're still working to clearly link that measurable genetic pattern to the actual subjective experience.
And the brain at death study, it's trying to correlate subjective reports like NDEs with objective measurable neurophysiological activity, EEG patterns, cellular changes, gamma waves.
Exactly. And they're debating, is that gamma surge actually a signature of consciousness? Or is it perhaps just a complex byproduct and echo of the brain shutting down?
Is measuring brain activity at death or searching for a genetic marker for psychic ability? Is it like a modern echo of trying to weigh the soul, using tools designed for the physical world to capture something that might, transcend them?
It's a great question. The Humanities article looks at this very problem, but within academia itself. Specifically, the struggle to assess the quality of scholarly work, which is a profoundly qualitative concept, right? Often using quantitative metrics. Things like citation counts, journal rankings, numerical evaluation scores.
Yeah, how do you possibly capture the depth of insight in a history paper or the originality of a literary analysis with just a number? It feels reductive.
That's the core struggle they articulate. The humanities scholars in the article, they acknowledge that quantification is already an inescapable part of academic life. You have grades, university rankings, funding applications. They all use metrics.
Sure.
So the debate for them isn't really whether to quantify, but how to do it, and under what conditions, under what standards. Their big concern is that applying simplistic, reductive, quantitative measures to complex, nuanced, qualitative work risks losing its essence, its soul, if you will, its real value.
So if they believe that, why would these scholars engage in the very process of rating or measuring quality? Why participate?
Well, they often see it as a pragmatic necessity. It's frequently driven by administrative pressures, funding requirements. It's unavoidable in many ways.
Okay.
So by participating, they can at least try to define the criteria and the standards themselves. They can try to shape the measurement process rather than just letting potentially inappropriate or damaging metrics be imposed from the outside.
I see. Get involved to set the rules.
Exactly. And they note a kind of collateral benefit, too. This external pressure sometimes forces the discipline to internally reflect more deeply on its own standards, its own goals, what it truly values.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. If measurement is going to happen anyway, better to be at the table defining how.
And you can see the direct parallel back to the brain at death research, can't you? That call we discussed for standardized data collection methods in neuroscience, it's very similar to the humanities scholars' desire for consensual standards and acceptable conditions for assessing quality, especially when you get into complex interdisciplinary areas.
Yeah, it really is similar.
So both fields, from hard neuroscience to the interpretive humanities, are grappling with this fundamental problem. How do we measure complex, maybe even ineffable phenomena? And are the tools we currently have truly sufficient or even appropriate for the task?
It ties everything together in a really unexpected way. Whether you're talking about trying to weigh the soul, or finding the neural correlate of consciousness, or rating the quality of academic scholarship, there's this consistent human drive, isn't there, to apply objective measures to subjective or complex qualitative experiences.
It really makes you consider the fundamental limits of our current tools, maybe the limits of quantification itself, and perhaps the very nature of these phenomena we're trying to grasp. What if some aspects of reality are just inherently resistant to being fully captured by quantitative methods alone?
So, okay, wrapping this up, we've taken quite a journey. We've looked into this intriguing, if tentative, genetic hint, possibly underlying psychic ability buried in the non-coding DNA. We explored the surprising electrical activity and the distinct phases in the brain around the moment of death and how NDEs might relate to that activity.
Right.
We examined the serious challenges in actually measuring this incredibly complex process reliably.
Yeah, the variability is huge.
And finally, we considered this universal struggle of measuring the seemingly immeasurable by looking at how even fields like the humanities grapple with assessing quality.
Despite the incredible scientific progress, mapping genetic variations down to single letters, tracking brain waves with increasing precision, detailing intricate cellular processes, profound mysteries definitely remain.
Absolutely.
We have these compelling correlations, some astonishing observations, powerful subjective reports. But the fundamental nature of consciousness, right at that boundary of life, the subjective reality of NDEs, the potential biological correlates of extraordinary abilities, they're still far from being fully understood.
Yeah.
Can objective measurement ever truly capture the richness, the entirety of subjective experience?
It makes you think about that fundamental human drive, doesn't it? To understand and quantify everything we encounter, from the mystical idea of the soul centuries ago to the intricate data streams of brain activity and DNA sequences today.
Mm-hmm.
But what if some aspects of reality, like maybe consciousness itself, or the deep value of humanistic insight, what if they are inherently resistant to being fully captured by our current quantitative methods?
It's a deep question. What knowledge, or maybe what kind of understanding, might we gain by actually embracing that complexity, by acknowledging the limits of our current measurement tools, rather than insisting that absolutely everything can or even should be reduced to a number? What really stands out to you from this whole deep dive?
For me, it's that potent reminder that the biggest, most fascinating questions often lie right at that intersection, the edge between what we can measure and what we still fundamentally struggle to grasp.
Yeah.
It really pushes us to look across disciplines, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The connections are often surprising.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and often quite surprising frontiers of consciousness, death, and that enduring challenge of measurement.